Hello everyone oder herzlich willkommen. Aber heute we are going to do this in English, so I guess you are all aware of that and not surprised at the moment. My name is Tim Stuchter. I'm the director of BIX, the Brandenburg Institute for Society and Security. And welcome to this PizzaSeminar. Once again, I have to say to those who participate online, the name might be a little misleading for you because either you make your own pizza or you are left hungry, because everyone who participates in person gets to eat pizza, as the name of the seminar suggests. We are doing this once a month, more or less. Often we present to you our own research from projects that we are doing at VIX, but also about, well, maybe even more often, we invite people where we are curious and would like to hear more about what it is that they are working on. And this is the case here with Lauri Heinonen. You are, as the name somehow suggests, you are from Finland,
yes.
but you are a PhD student at the University of Bamberg. Nevertheless, we talked about this earlier. We don't force you to give your presentation in German, but we are going to do this in English. BIX is, because of its founding fathers, a civil security research think tank. However, given the changing of the times, or as the Germans say, Zeitenwende, we more and more also touch areas that at least are somewhat in the grayish area between civil and military security. And since we are in particular interested in all economic aspects of security, your research topic is of particular interest to us. So, as well, you all know from the invitation today, you will give us some insights into the military-industrial complex and the cooperation between Russia and China. I guess it's obvious for everyone why this is of particular interest for a country like Germany, given the war in Ukraine and everything that is going on in the world. You are doing this not necessarily only as part of your PhD research, but also because you are a non-resident research fellow at the Finnish Defence University.
Yes, exactly.
And you are involved in some projects there that are much closer to this topic.
Exactly.
And that's where you gained your insights. So we are very much looking for your talk. Thank you for making the way from Bamberg, not from Helsinki, but from Bamberg to Berlin today to speak to us. And yeah, we look forward to your insights. So thank you, and everyone else, please eat. Maybe in 5 minutes or so, I will go around and change the pizza a little bit so that you don't always have to eat from the same pizza. Lauri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes. So as said, my theme today is the military-industrial cooperation of China and Russia, and I have done this research based on original research, academic research in Chinese, made in China, and by academic original research in Russia, made in Russian, and that's why I think I can bring some more insights than other studies, perhaps. So about my career, just to give you some background. So as we just learned, I've been working on this project at the Finnish National Defence University as a project researcher. However, I have also earlier background related to these teams. So during my undergraduate and graduate studies, I did a 6 month internship in the Finnish embassy in Moscow just before the war. So I left there something like 3 or 4 days before the war started. And
was it by coincidence or because the intelligence? Finland was more intelligent than the German one.
Well, the story is that my internship would have ended in the end of February, but I had some holiday left there, so I could leave a bit early, and because I saw what the situation was evolving into, so I realized that it might be a good idea to leave a bit early.
So it was your intelligence.
My personal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also have done an internship in Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies, or BOFIT. And there I've done research into the economy of Russia and the economy of Ukraine. And I wrote there a major report on Ukraine's economy, and I can give a link to you to it after the presentation. So the name of my report is Chinese Russian military industrial cooperation in the 2020s towards true joint capabilities or merely transactional great power politics. So the idea of my report is to study this military industrial and technological cooperation between the countries, but also give some other insight into the relations between the countries. And something I want to note at this point is that about the terminology I use in the report. So even though most people might use terms like defense industry or military industry, I use this term military industrial complex in the report because the terms that Russians and Chinese use on their own defense industry are very similar to this military industrial complex, at least by as words. Not they have different nuance, but they still have this industrial complex idea. So what is unique in my paper? So as I told you, I have used Russian and Chinese original. Oh, wait. Something happened. Yeah, now. Good. So I viewed Russian and Chinese original literature. So first, I also have Western literature. So this Western literature, I've searched for it through online databases and by visiting websites of different Western think tanks and so on. But when I've been searching for these Russian and Chinese studies, I've done this by looking at open access databases in Russian open access databases for the Russian literature, and I've used another database, Chinese database on the Chinese literature. And for the material of my study, I had something like 100 studies from each of these categories. So 100 Western, 100 Russian, 100 Chinese studies, and then I picked the most important ones to this paper. And I think my source material also helps to give more insights into these questions. So something about the relations between Russia and China, the history. So when the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the relations between the Soviet Union and China were good. So the Soviet Union gave major support to China, for example, by sending experts there to give their expertise for the Chinese, and also by having an industrial project with the Chinese. So this lasted for some years during Stalin's time. But after Stalin died, and there was a de-Stalinization process in the Soviet Union, this broke the relations between the countries very badly. And the relations were so bad that in the 1960s, there was almost a major war between the countries that could have resulted in a nuclear catastrophe. But that was avoided, but there was a risk for that in the 60s. Well, even though this was a bad time in the relations, the countries started to improve their relations by discussing the border disputes they had since the 19th century. So in the 1980s, this process accelerated, and therefore the countries started to improve their relations by discussing the border disputes and finding solutions to those. And this time, the arms trade between the countries resumed, and it was common in this time that the Russians sold technology to the Chinese because China still lacked military industrial capabilities to produce its own military industrial technologies. However, when we get closer to today, so say around 2010s, at this time China already had more capacity to produce its own military technology, and therefore China has started to compete with Russia on the military industrial market, and both countries are now selling weapons to different parts of the world, and they are competing with each other. And this is also a time, roughly the last 10 years, when this rhetoric in the countries have taken a turn to more cordial or more friendly. So I'll return to this later in the presentation, but at some earlier phases, even in the early 2000s, there's some reservedness in the rhetoric within the countries. So the recent years have seen a major change in this rhetoric between the countries in their relations. So now I'll explain some major points about these economic aspects of the military industries of these countries. So one thing that the Chinese and Russian literature discuss is this relevance of civilian production in the military industrial sector. So in China, it is common that the military industrial firms also have civilian production. So I think in practice, this could, for example, mean that if you have a factory that produces civilian vehicles, the same factory could produce some military vehicles or their components. And this is important for the Chinese military industrial complex because this gives production capacity and income flows to the sector, which means that the firms can use the civilian production as a buffer for the military production that is less profitable as this civilian production. But in Russia, this is worse. So in Russia, it's typical that the military industrial production is done by a handful of major government-owned or major corporations close to the government, and there are much fewer spillovers to the other parts of the economy. And essentially, when you look at what Russia exports to or has exported to other countries, Russia has two products it exports: so natural resources and weapons. And some Russian studies say that around 70% of all high-tech production in Russia is military equipment and weapons and so on. So this tells about the relevance of the sector in Russia, but also how the issues in civilian production weaken the economy there. Another thing that comes up in the literature is that Russia suffers of major brain drain or losing its talent abroad. So something like, even before the war, something like anyway, a major deal of potential researchers like masters and PhD students who would do their research in Russia, they leave Russia and they don't come back. So this is one issue that Russian literature raises, whereas China has the opposite situation. So they are sending a lot of students to West, especially to the USA, both students and researchers, to do their studies and work there. And it's common for these Chinese researchers to return to China and provide new human capital for the military industrial sector. So Russia is losing its human capital abroad, whereas China is gaining it back by sending people and getting them back there. Well, an issue in the Russian innovation policy is that it's very state-centered and it has little spillovers, as I've said, whereas China has an industrial policy and innovation policy after the US example. So in China, it's common that there are government agencies and research labs that work on basic research, and then there are research labs in firms that do more applied research, and these are cooperating among themselves. So one part of the Chinese rise to industrial power is that it has taken example from advanced countries in how innovation policies should work. the Russian military industrial sector has other issues. So one issue during the war now is that the arms exports have been reduced because Russia needs its own weapons. However, an issue here is that the arms exports are generally more profitable than delivering arms to your own government or your own military. So this also undermines the financial stability of the sector. And one issue that Russia also has are the high inflation and the high interest rates due to the war. And the Russian government has tried to fix these issues by giving preferential loans to the military industrial firms, but the sector is still struggling. So now we'll get to the technologies that the Russian and Chinese military industrial sectors produce. So one thing I must mention, so even though I've been looking for examples in the literature about this military industrial cooperation, there are not coming many of those there. So one interesting thing is that even though there's a lot of discussion even in the official debates, say official government communications about the military industrial cooperation, the literature in these countries doesn't find that many concrete projects. There are some projects, like for example in the nuclear energy, there are concrete projects there, but when it comes to these more advanced military technologies, then there's not so much coming up, and that's interesting. There's a mismatch between what the government officially says and what you can find as practical examples. So the baseline is that it's much about talk with little output. Well, some major technologies that both Russia and China are developing are hypersonic weapons. Because these are weapons, for example, missiles that are faster than sound, which means that they are very hard to. It's hard to block them. For example, if you with any defense systems, and therefore these hypersonic weapons are a threat to the nuclear deterrence of major powers, because these weapons are at least now able to go past these systems somehow. Another major technology that both Russia and China are investing in is military AI. So it is especially important for Russia because Russia is weaker than NATO in conventional forces. So Russia wants to invest in the military AI because this is a good way for it to balance the situation with NATO and to even out the differences in power. About the dual-use technologies, so Russia tends to be strong in traditional heavy industry technologies like aviation, and this is their strength. However, where they are weaker are emerging technologies like AI and ICT. So this is something that might motivate Russia to work more with China, whereas China is relatively weaker in traditional technologies, just like aviation, but it's stronger in these emerging technologies like ICT and AI. And this is why there are some complementarities. But one sector of the traditional heavy industries is shipbuilding, because I've read Russian literature that says that China controls around a half of the world's shipbuilding capacity, which means that even without this war and the deterioration of the relations between Russia and the West, Russia would still need to work with the Chinese because they control so much of the shipbuilding capacity in the world. And as I've told you about this innovation policy, so Russia is dependent on the central government and centralized major corporations, whereas China has a more flexible approach to this innovation policy. And in China, private firms and regional governments are more important. So in China, around 70% of all public innovation funding comes from regional governments. And therefore, I think in China, this technology they produce meets the needs of the economy better. Well, as I've told you, so there was some reservedness in the rhetoric still in the early 2000s. So when I look at these early 2000s documents about the relations, something that strikes me is the language. So there are many paragraphs in these agreements that, for example, Russia and China must not use military force against each other, and they must retreat their troops from the border regions. So I think the language of those early 2000s documents show that there's mistrust and distrust between the countries, or there was, and they had not resolved that. But there's a clear change in the official rhetoric after the war in Ukraine escalated in 2022. So now these agreements and joint statements are more cordial, and they focus on listing areas of cooperation like technology, health, agriculture, so on. However, when I've looked at this unofficial academic rhetoric of academic studies in Russia and China, there's a clear difference to the official rhetoric. So when you look at the Western literature, they tend to say that the cooperation of Russia and China is threatening to NATO, Europe, and the USA, and that this cooperation is very advanced. This is generally the opinion of the Western literature. However, when you look at Russian literature, they say that it's dangerous to have too close cooperation with China, because that might limit Russia's political and economic and military room to make its own decisions. And therefore, Russian literature tends to emphasize is that China can make more demands on Russia in future if this dependence on China increases. And therefore, they say that we should find some way to balance this, or to be not too dependent on China. The Chinese literature says that both Russia and China benefit from the cooperation, and therefore they should pursue it to the fullest. But Chinese studies tend to also say that that Russia doesn't want to go deep in the cooperation, so they are they are feeling sad about it, and they say that Russia should work more with us. It will be good for them. So some practical examples of these themes that are covered in different literatures. So an example in Western literature that emphasizes the advanced nature of this cooperation are the early warning systems, or systems that warn about coming attacks from the enemy, for example, through missiles and so on. Well, in 2019, Vladimir Putin made a statement that Russia is helping China to build this kind of early warning system in China, which China didn't have at that point. So many Western observers thought, okay, now they are very deep into their cooperation, and this is more like an alliance now. However, in like almost 10 years, there's been practically nothing about these early warning systems anymore. So this is an example of this, the official rhetoric, but when you look at what they've concretely achieved, it's much less. An example of the Russian literature, examples of these technologies where they have distrust towards China are nuclear weapons and energy cooperation. So there are some examples there on these, that they don't trust the Chinese, whereas space cooperation is an example in the Chinese literature that says that, okay, this is where we want to cooperate. And now I'll give you some examples. So this study by Bagdanov. So I'll explain these points in orange into you. So for you, so that the preliminary reduction of nuclear forces of the leading governments make no sense to Washington and Moscow, because there's no solution to the problem that how much China does have warheads and these carriers for these warheads. And the other point they make is that this all can be evidence of that. Beijing doesn't now have enough own motivation to join international regimes of weapons control. So this is an example of how they say that you cannot trust Chinese, and that the Chinese are playing their own games without cooperation. Here is another example from a Chinese study. So here they say that in the in the real cooperation, Russia shows lack of trust or distrust towards the Chinese, and they also say that the Russian official communications emphasize this cooperation with Asian countries, and that Russian scientists and scientific community also emphasizes this Russian turn to the East policy, or working more with Asia. But it's undeniable that the USA and Europe have long been the preferred partners of Russia outside the Commonwealth of Independent States. And even though this has started to change after 2022. So this is an example of how the Chinese think that Russians could cooperate with us and they should cooperate with us, but they are not doing that. So one general conclusion is about the economy and the technological relations between Russia and China is that Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. So Russia is quite dependent on China in many technologies, especially now that it's sanctioned by the West. And Russia also needs China for its economy, for example, to sell natural resources like gas and oil to get funding for its war efforts. So Russia is very dependent on China, and it's likely that reverting this dependence would be difficult for Russia, and they might want to do that at some point, but it might be very difficult. And in general, the outlook for the Russian military industrial sector is that the outlook is bad, or worse, at least worse than China. And many of the technologies they have put forward in the recent years have been only updates to earlier technologies. So, for example, when Russia has introduced new missiles in recent years, they have promoted these new missiles as a major threat to NATO. Be scared of us. But in reality, many experts think that Western experts think that these are only updates to existing technologies, and they don't add much to the Russian military industrial capabilities, but they are more like political signaling. Even though China emphasizes the need to cooperate with Russia, it seems that China wants to do this cooperation on its own terms. So, for example, supporting Russia militarily or economically is important for China because it doesn't want that Russia loses in the Ukraine or generally grows weaker. So it is in the Chinese interest to support Russia, even though and the cooperation might not be so cordial as the Chinese tend to say. So, but anyway, the Chinese military industrial sector seems to have a good outlook. So they have a strong industrial base, and they have this human capital that they have strong human capital, and they get more abroad. So in general, I would imagine that the only case where China would lose much of its capabilities soon would be if there was some major breakup for the world economy and the global value chains, and this globalization would take a major turn back. But I don't think that is happening anytime soon, especially because China is so important in the world economy. But some major conclusions here are that the cooperation between Russia and China are not as close as Western sources tend to say. Well, some insights for the Western military industrial complexes. So what should we also pay attention to? I think we should also pay attention to this idea that civilian production in the military industrial sector is important for the production capacity and financial stability of these sectors. So having civilian production there as well might be relevant, and also the importance of arms exports. So Western countries should also invest in arms exports because that also helps to build up the production capacity and financial stability to this sector. Well, some scenarios that Western countries should prepare for include this inflation and high interest rates if there's, for example, some major disruptions to the world economy. Now we have the war in Iran, for example. But if there was some major disruption to these production chains, it would be important that we have some scenarios how we prepare for the high inflation and interest rates that need to be raised to curb the inflation. So that's something we must prepare for. Another thing I think is important is the human capital for the military industrial sector. So when we want to improve our defense in Europe, for example, it would be important that we invest in this human capital to have enough talented people there working for us. And this is actually the final slide. So I've been making some ideas about factors that affect these relations of Russia and China, and how they impact Europe and the West. So one thing is that currently China is supporting Russia, and that's mostly to prevent West from defeating Russia in Ukraine. So I don't think this is changing anytime soon, because China wants to balance between having good relations with the West and having the economic relations working, but it doesn't want Russia loses either. Another thing is in case of potential, another case of China's support to Russia could be if there was a conflict between NATO and Russia. So here China would need to balance, because on one hand it wants to support Russia to prevent it from failing, but on the other hand, Europe and West are so important economically, so that will be also a difficult spot for China as well. So not only for us, but also for China. And my conclusion on what Russia would do if there was a conflict over Taiwan is that Russia would support China, but only so little as it's politically possible. So this would be the political aim of Russia. It's hard to say what this would mean in practice, but I think that Russia would like to stay out of that conflict as much as it can, and stay out as much as it's just possible. Well, some factors that affect these relations between China, Russia, West, and the West are the cooperation between Russia and China. So Russia is dependent on China, and I think there's pressure in Russia to reduce the dependence on China. Currently, the political leadership is emphasizing this need to fight in Ukraine, and they are ready to increase their dependence on China to take the risk. But I think that there's pressure in Russia that at some point there must be a change, because many Russians think that, or experts at least think that this dependence on China is dangerous. And something I think the general conclusions in European debate that Europe must be more resilient and have less critical dependencies on single foreign economies is important, because if Europe is very dependent on China, when there's if there's an aggression of Russia on NATO, that would also us in a tough spot. So some kind of feasible and rational decoupling or spreading the economic risks and production chains globally would be meaningful inside Europe and outside Europe with other partners. Well, the second factor are the political reactions of different countries. So for Russia, as I said, Russia is likely to want to reduce this dependence on China if it's possible, but it also depends on what the West does. So I think that Europe is not going to normalize the relations with Russia that soon. At some point, yes, maybe, but not so soon. How many questions there? But I think that the US reactions can vary more. So I think what the US government is currently doing is that they are investing in playing China and Russia a bit against each other to make China a bit weaker. I think this is one aspect of their foreign policy, or what they are planning to do. However, I think they are over investing in improving. They are over investing in their relations with Russia at the cost of their relations with Europe, because Europe is still more important as an ally and more useful even to the USA. So Thank you.